The ballroom was a sea of glittering gowns and sharp suits, the clinking of crystal glasses and soft laughter hanging in the air like a thick perfume. The grand chandelier above cast a soft glow over the guests, who spun and swayed, lost in the music, their lives already mapped out in the rigid circles of society. But for Emily, tonight was different. She stood at the far edge of the room, her gown too simple, her posture too rigid, as if she didn't belong in the world around her. Her eyes drifted over the sea of faces, some smiling with practiced ease, others laughing with a touch of cruelty. She was nothing in this room, just a shadow, a forgotten face. But then, the music shifted, the sound growing sharper, colder, and every head in the room turned as Duke William Montague entered. The crowd seemed to part for him as he walked in, every eye following the man whose very presence commanded the space, whose power was felt before he even spoke. He moved with the grace of a lion, his eyes scanning the room with the practiced indifference of a man who had long since made his choice. His dark, commanding gaze swept over the gathered women, each poised, perfect, presented as if they were objects to be chosen. And then, for just a heartbeat, his eyes paused. The moment felt like time itself had slowed. His gaze locked onto Emily, and she froze. In that single second, the world around her disappeared. The laughter faded into a distant hum. The rustle of silk and satin around her seemed miles away, and all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart. Her breath hitched in her chest, the air thick with the weight of his stare. She had never been noticed before, never been the center of attention in a room full of beautiful, wealthy women. Her hands clenched the fabric of her dress, the simple, unadorned gown suddenly feeling like a prison. The Duke's steps were slow, deliberate, and every footfall seemed to echo in the sudden stillness of the room. The soft rustling of his coat as he moved through the crowd was the only sound that filled the space. Emily's legs felt like they were made of stone, rooted to the floor, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't control. The room was holding its breath. He reached her, his presence towering, all-consuming. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. His eyes did all the talking. Emily felt exposed under his gaze, as if every hidden insecurity, every whispered insult, every moment she had ever been made to feel invisible had been laid bare. She looked up at him, her voice caught in her throat, her body still as stone. His lips parted, and the words that came from him were a whisper, but they hit her like thunder in the silence. "You," he said, as if the word itself had power. The room around her snapped back into focus, the whispers starting, the gasps rippling through the crowd. Emily's heart skipped a beat. He had chosen her. But for a moment, it felt like a cruel joke. She, the one they had all ignored, the one they had all dismissed, was now the object of his attention. The Duke reached out a hand to her, his fingers brushing against hers, and the touch sent a jolt of electricity through her. His eyes never left hers, and as the crowd parted, she realized just how much she had been overlooked, how much she had been forgotten, until now. The world she had once known was slipping away, and in its place was a future she could neither understand nor escape. The silence that followed his words was heavy, suffocating, as if the entire room had collectively held its breath. Emily stood motionless, her heart hammering in her chest. Her fingers trembled where they brushed against his. The touch was brief, yet electric, and it sent a ripple of shock through her body. The Duke's eyes were unwavering, sharp and cold, as if he were carving her into a moment of time that no one could erase. The other guests in the ballroom had frozen, their gazes shifting between Emily and the Duke, whispers rising in the air like smoke. Emily's chest tightened, and she felt a flush creep up her neck, her breath shallow. For a fleeting moment, she wondered if this was all some cruel jest, a game at her expense. But Duke William Montague was not a man to indulge in such things. His every word, his every movement was calculated, deliberate. His gaze, though piercing, seemed to hold something else. She couldn't place it, something that pulled at her, something she had never seen before in his eyes. The Duke stepped closer, and Emily's heart skipped a beat. His presence enveloped her, overwhelming and suffocating. The world around her seemed to shrink. The noise of the ballroom faded into a distant hum, and all she could hear was the rapid beating of her own pulse. As he neared, his hand stretched out once more, this time with intent. His fingers brushed the back of her hand, sending a shockwave of awareness through her. His touch was gentle but firm, a stark contrast to the coldness of his eyes. For a moment, she thought she might collapse under the weight of it all. His hand lingered for a fraction longer than expected before he turned to face the crowd, his presence commanding the room. The tension in the air thickened, as if a storm was about to break. The whispers that had swirled around her began to intensify. Her name was no longer spoken with disdain or indifference. Now it was a topic of intrigue, of disbelief. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. Why her? Why had he chosen her, the girl who had always been invisible in society's eyes? She had spent her life in the shadows, always overlooked, always dismissed. And now, here she was, standing in the center of the most powerful ballroom in Europe, with the Duke's attention focused solely on her. She didn't understand. She didn't know how to react. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, she felt a surge of panic. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. All that filled the space between them was the silence, thick and unyielding. Duke William glanced over his shoulder, his gaze locking onto her once again. There was no warmth in his eyes, no softness. But in the stillness, Emily felt a shift, something that vibrated in the very air between them. The power dynamic had changed in an instant. She was no longer the forgotten one, the invisible woman in the corner of the room. She was the center of attention, the focus of the Duke's choice. It was as if the entire room had bent to his will, as if the universe had rearranged itself to align with his decision. The guests, the other women, the men, they were all watching, all waiting. And Emily? She was caught in the whirlwind of it all, unsure of what had just happened or how to respond. Duke William turned his body, stepping back to face the crowd, his hand still hovering over hers. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than any declaration could, and the weight of that silence pressed down on Emily like a 1,000-pound stone. She felt the eyes of the room upon her, the stares, the judgment, the envy. The once familiar feeling of being invisible was replaced by something far more intense, something darker, more dangerous. She was the object of attention, the chosen one. But what did it mean? What was the Duke's true intention? Was this truly her moment of recognition, or was it something else, something she could not yet understand? The Duke's hand dropped from hers, and the tension in the air didn't dissipate. It hung there, thick and charged, as if the next moment would break everything open. Emily took a hesitant step back, her mind racing, her body trembling. The room, once so full of life and laughter, now seemed like a cage, its walls closing in around her. And yet, there was no escape. Not now. Not when the Duke had chosen her. Not when everything had shifted in the span of a heartbeat. The ball was no longer a place of carefree indulgence. It had become a battleground, and she, caught in the Duke's web, was standing at its center. The room buzzed with whispers, the air thick with tension, as Emily stood frozen at the center of the ballroom, her heart pounding in her chest. Duke William's hand had just left hers, but the heat of his touch still lingered, like a brand on her skin. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, followed his every movement as he turned back toward the crowd, his commanding presence pulling the attention of every person in the room. The once lively chatter had dulled to a quiet murmur, the atmosphere shifting like a storm on the horizon. Emily felt the weight of 1,000 eyes upon her, but none as intense as the Duke's. His gaze never wavered as he moved toward the center of the room, leaving Emily standing at the edge, caught between the past she had known and the future she could not yet grasp. Her hands clenched at her sides, the fabric of her dress bunched in her fists as she struggled to breathe, her chest tight with a mix of fear and confusion. What had just happened? Why her? She had spent so long on the fringes, unnoticed, until now. The Duke's eyes flickered back to her, and for a moment, time seemed to stretch, each second hanging between them like a fragile thread. Then, as though sensing her inner turmoil, he stepped toward her once more. The room fell silent, the tension mounting with each of his calculated steps. His presence was overpowering, and as he closed the distance, Emily's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what to expect, but her body reacted to him before her mind could catch up. She stood rooted to the floor, her heart racing, the air around her growing heavier with every passing moment. Duke William reached her again, and this time, there was no hesitation in his movement. He placed his hand on her arm, his touch firm but not forceful, guiding her through the room, away from the whispers, away from the judgment. His fingers brushed against her skin, sending a jolt of awareness through her body. She wanted to pull away, to protest, but she couldn't. There was something in his grip, something unyielding, that left no room for escape. As they moved through the crowd, Emily felt the eyes of the room following them, the stares of the other women burning into her back. She was the object of their envy, the center of their attention, but it felt like a weight she wasn't sure how to bear. Duke William didn't acknowledge the whispers, the gasps, or the stares. He didn't need to. His power was absolute, and his silence spoke volumes. He was the one who had chosen her. Emily couldn't help but wonder why. What was it about her that had caught his eye when so many others stood far more impressive in appearance and station? But there were no answers, only the press of his fingers around her arm and the steady rhythm of his steps. He was guiding her with purpose, his direction clear. They reached the far side of the room, where a small group of nobles gathered in a circle, their voices hushed as they watched the unfolding scene. The Duke didn't stop. He led Emily past them, his presence undeniable, and as they moved, she felt the eyes of the gathered guests shift from her to him. Her heart pounded louder in her ears, and her legs felt as though they might give way beneath her. The power dynamic in the room had shifted in an instant, and Emily was the unexpected prize. She had been chosen. The weight of it was suffocating. Duke William stopped just before the large windows that looked out over the sprawling estate, the moonlight casting a pale glow across the marble floors. He turned toward her then, his gaze never leaving hers. The stillness between them was electric, and Emily found herself drawn into his eyes, as if they held the answers to every question she had ever asked about her own worth. "You belong here now," he said, his voice low but clear, the words carrying an authority that seemed to resonate through her very bones. "Don't forget it." His words were simple, but the impact of them struck her like a thunderclap. She had been chosen. She, the woman who had spent so long on the outside, had now been brought to the center of it all. But what did it mean? What did he expect from her? She didn't know, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. But one thing was clear: she was no longer invisible. She was no longer the forgotten one in the corner. She was seen. She was chosen. And the power she had once longed for was now in her grasp, though she wasn't sure if she could hold it. The room around them began to buzz again, the silence shattered by the realization that the Duke had made his decision. Guests whispered among themselves, and Emily felt her position shift even more, the weight of it pressing down on her. But she couldn't escape the Duke's gaze. It was unwavering, unyielding, like the force of a storm that she couldn't outrun. He had chosen her, and now, everything was different. The ballroom had shifted, the air thick with an unspoken tension that now clung to every surface. Duke William stood at the center, his eyes never leaving Emily as she stood before him, unsure of the path that had been set before her. The whispers had started. Again, louder now, like an angry current beneath the surface. Emily's heart raced in her chest, the weight of every gaze in the room pressing down on her. But she held her ground, the sharp, cold silence of the moment wrapping itself around her like a cloak. The power dynamic had changed. She could feel it. She was no longer the invisible one, but she was not sure if she was ready for the storm this new role had summoned. She had been chosen by the Duke, and that fact alone sent shockwaves through the room. The rich, powerful women, once sure of their place in this world, now glanced at her with a mixture of disbelief and barely veiled contempt. They had never seen her as anything more than an afterthought, a shadow in the corner, a nobody. But now, Emily was standing at the very heart of it all, the center of the Duke's attention, and they couldn't look away. She wasn't sure if she wanted their attention. In fact, she hated it. Every set of eyes that followed her movements made her skin crawl. The room seemed to grow smaller, more suffocating, with every passing second. Then, as if sensing her discomfort, Duke William stepped forward again, his presence looming like a storm cloud over her. The room fell silent once more. He didn't touch her this time, but his proximity alone made her pulse race. His gaze swept over her once again, sharp, calculating, as if he were sizing her up, deciding something only he could understand. Emily's breath hitched in her chest, her legs trembling slightly beneath her, yet she stood still, caught between the powerful force of the Duke and the crushing weight of the expectations now placed upon her. Her thoughts were interrupted as one of the other noblewomen, a lady whose name Emily couldn't even remember, stepped forward. The woman's voice rang out in the tense silence, dripping with disdain. "Are you truly going to disgrace us all, Duke?" she sneered. "Is she really the one you have chosen?" The words hit Emily like a slap in the face, but the Duke didn't flinch. His gaze didn't waver. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took another step toward Emily, closing the distance between them. His presence was so commanding that it felt like the air itself thickened. He didn't raise his voice, didn't offer an explanation. Instead, he simply looked at the woman, his eyes cold and unyielding. "I have made my choice," he said, his voice low and deliberate, yet carrying the weight of a decision that none could contest. The woman's lips tightened, her eyes flashing with outrage, but she didn't dare challenge him further. The room held its breath, waiting for the fallout, for the confrontation that everyone could feel was coming. But the Duke didn't give it to them. He turned his attention back to Emily, and for the first time since he had chosen her, there was something softer in his gaze. It was only a flicker, a momentary shift, but it was enough. "You will come with me," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The words were simple, but they carried an undeniable command. Emily's mind raced. She wanted to protest, to ask why, to demand answers, but the power in his voice left her speechless. He was not asking. He was telling her. And so, she followed him, her legs shaky, her heart thundering in her chest. As they moved through the ballroom, every step they took seemed to echo in the stillness. The guests parted for them, their faces a mix of awe, envy, and shock. Emily felt every eye on her, as if she were walking through a gauntlet. She had become the object of their judgment, their envy, their fascination. The power had shifted, and Emily, once a shadow in the room, was now the center of it all. As they reached the door, Duke William turned to face her once more, his expression unreadable. "Do not mistake this," he said, his voice low, almost a warning. "This is not a favor. It is your place." Emily's breath caught in her throat. The weight of his words settled over her like a cloak, heavy and suffocating. She was not chosen out of kindness, nor out of love. She had been chosen because she was the one he wanted, the one who would serve his purposes. And in that moment, Emily realized that she was standing at the precipice of a world she didn't understand, a world of power, of politics, of expectations. Expression, but there was none. Only cold stares, eyes filled with contempt and curiosity. As they stopped in the center of the room, Emily felt as though the floor beneath her was giving way. The power dynamic had shifted in an instant. She was no longer the one ignored, the one who could fade into the background. Now, she was the one being watched, the one everyone would scrutinize, the one who had been chosen by the Duke. She swallowed hard, but her throat felt tight, and she couldn't speak. Duke William didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he didn't care. His gaze was locked on her, intense and calculating, as if he were reading her every thought. His lips curled into the slightest of smiles, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and for a moment, Emily wondered if he was amused by her discomfort. The silence stretched on, the tension between them palpable. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and commanding, but not for Emily's ears alone. "She will be seated beside me," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The words hit the crowd like a wave, and for a brief moment, the air seemed to freeze. The noblewomen exchanged shocked glances, and the whispers began again, louder this time, filled with disbelief and outrage. Emily's stomach twisted, but she didn't move, didn't dare to look away from the Duke's unflinching gaze. His command had been given, and there was no turning back. She was the chosen one now, and the weight of that choice threatened to crush her. The room, once filled with the soft music and laughter of high society, now seemed like a battlefield, the stakes higher than ever before. The Duke's power was undeniable, and it radiated from him in waves. It was in the way he stood, the way he commanded attention without saying a word, the way every movement of his hand seemed to dictate the rhythm of the room. Emily had always known that Duke William was powerful, but being this close to him, feeling the pressure of his presence, made her realize just how much control he had over everything in his world. And now, she was a part of it, a part of the game. As the guests fell into their seats, some reluctantly, others with barely concealed resentment, Emily felt the eyes of the entire room turn toward her. They watched her every movement, their expectations and judgments heavy in the air. Her breath caught in her throat, but she held herself steady, forcing her legs to carry her as the Duke guided her toward the seat beside him. She was the object of their fascination, but she was also the target of their disdain. And with every step she took, every eye that followed her, the pressure grew. Finally, she reached her seat, and as she sat, she could feel the weight of the Duke's gaze upon her, unwavering, like a constant reminder of her place. She had been chosen. But what did that mean? What was her role in this new world she had entered? This world of power and politics, where every glance, every whisper, carried the weight of 1,000 expectations. She didn't know the answer, but she would find out. As the music resumed and the chatter slowly began to rise again, the tension in the room never truly dissipated. It lingered, thick and suffocating, wrapping itself around Emily like a chain. The power shift was undeniable, and she was at the center of it. But even as the guests around her resumed their conversation, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed in that single moment. She was no longer the invisible girl in the corner. She was the one they all watched, the one they all judged. And as the Duke settled into his seat beside her, his presence like an unspoken command, she knew that there was no going back. She was now part of his world, and that world was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The room had grown even more tense, the atmosphere thick with unspoken words, as Duke William Montague and Emily sat at the heart of the ballroom. The once celebratory air now felt heavy, like a storm waiting to break. Emily sat beside the Duke, her body stiff with the weight of his presence, her mind racing with a million questions she couldn't voice. She could feel the weight of the stares, the judgment, the whispers that circled her like vultures. She had been thrust into this world of power, where every glance, every movement carried meaning. And now, as she sat at the Duke's side, she realized how little she truly understood. Her hands trembled in her lap, but she forced herself to still them. She couldn't show weakness, not here, not in front of him, not in front of them. She had been chosen, but the path ahead was unclear, and the uncertainty gnawed at her like a relentless hunger. Duke William's gaze never left her, his eyes sharp and calculating, as if he were reading her every thought. He didn't speak, didn't offer comfort. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to command the room, to shift the power in a way that no one could ignore. The whispers around them grew louder, but the Duke didn't acknowledge them. He didn't need to. His power was absolute, and in the space between them, the tension built like the tightening of a noose. Emily's heart raced as she struggled to understand the dynamics at play, the rules of this world that she had only just entered. She had always been on the outside, the one who didn't belong, the one who was ignored, but now, she was the center of attention, and the weight of it was crushing. The room seemed to press in on her, the walls closing in, suffocating her with the expectation of it all. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this, ready for the scrutiny, the judgment, the games that were now her reality. And then, just as the silence reached its breaking point, a voice cut through the air, sharp and filled with disdain. "How can you choose her, Duke?" The voice belonged to Lady Eleanor, a woman who had been at the Duke's side for years, a fixture in this world of power and politics. Her words were laced with venom, her eyes flicking to Emily with contempt. "She is nothing. She has no place here. You dishonor us all." The room fell silent once more, the tension in the air thick enough to cut through. Emily's chest tightened, her heart pounding in her throat, but she didn't look away from Lady Eleanor. The woman's words were sharp, but they weren't the ones that hurt the most. It was the way the room seemed to nod in agreement, the way the other women looked at her as though she were a threat, an upstart who had no business being in their world. Lady Eleanor's eyes flicked back to the Duke, and for a moment, Emily saw something flicker in her gaze, something dark, something possessive. "Do you truly wish to make a mockery of everything you've worked for?" she continued, her voice smooth but dangerous. The Duke didn't respond immediately. His gaze shifted to Emily, his eyes hard, unreadable, as if he were contemplating something. Emily's pulse quickened under the weight of his stare, but she didn't flinch. She wouldn't. Not now. Not when everything had already changed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the Duke's voice cut through the tension, low and unwavering. "You will not speak to her that way," he said, his words crisp and final. The room seemed to freeze in place, every eye locked on him, every ear straining to hear. The power shift in the room was palpable, like a gust of wind that swept through a field, knocking everything in its path. Emily felt the force of his command ripple through her, the authority in his voice settling like a weight on her shoulders. She had been chosen. There was no going back. Lady Eleanor's face flushed with anger, her lips pressed tight as she stared at the Duke, but she said nothing more. She could not challenge him. No one could. The Duke had spoken, and in his world, his word was law. Emily's mind raced as she processed what had just happened. She had been publicly defended by the Duke, a powerful, dangerous man whose very presence changed the course of the room. The other guests had fallen silent, their eyes now trained on her, and she could feel their curiosity, their disdain, their judgment. But there was something else in the air too, something that Emily couldn't name. It was the weight of power, the taste of it, as it hung in the space between her and the Duke. He had chosen her. But the question remained. Why? What did he want from her? The Duke's hand rested on the back of her chair, and for a moment, she could feel the warmth of his touch radiating through the space between them. The contact was fleeting, but it left a mark on her, a lingering sense of possession that she couldn't shake. He had chosen her, but she was still very much in the dark about the reasons why, and the tension between them had not dissipated. It had only grown, like a storm that had yet to break. She was caught in the eye of it, and she didn't know how to navigate this new world, this new reality that had been thrust upon her. But as the Duke's eyes flicked to the guests around them, the unspoken command in his gaze told her one thing. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer the girl who could be discarded. She was the one who had been chosen, and the game had only just begun. The ballroom had never felt so small. The noise, the laughter, the music, all of it was drowned out by the pressure that pressed in on Emily from every side. The whispers were louder now, sharper, and their venomous undertones clung to her skin like a heavy cloak. The Duke's hand had not left the back of her chair, and Emily could feel the warmth of his touch, a constant reminder that she was now his. And yet, with every second that passed, every look exchanged, the room became more suffocating. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing, and every movement felt like it was under a magnifying glass, watched by 100 pairs of eyes. The tension in the air was palpable, thick like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. She had thought that being chosen by the Duke would give her some sense of security, but instead, she felt more exposed than ever before. The power had shifted, but Emily wasn't sure she was ready for it. She wasn't sure she even understood it. Her life, which had once been a quiet, invisible existence, had now been thrust into the public eye. The Duke's power was undeniable, and now it seemed to extend to her, whether she liked it or not. The women around her, the ones who had once smiled sweetly at her, pretending to care, now turned their heads with disdain, their whispered judgments loud in the silence that seemed to stretch between them. Lady Eleanor, who had challenged the Duke earlier, was standing at the far end of the room, her eyes narrowed, her mouth set in a thin line. Her gaze flicked to Emily, then back to the Duke, as if she were weighing something, calculating her next move. Emily felt it, the challenge in Lady Eleanor's eyes, the way she seemed to be sizing her up, deciding whether she was worthy of the Duke's favor or if she was simply an upstart who needed to be put in her place. And then, there was the Duke. His gaze was sharp, unwavering, as it rested on Emily, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw something flicker in his expression, something almost imperceptible, a shadow of doubt, or perhaps amusement. But it was gone before she could fully process it. She could feel his presence like a weight on her chest. He had chosen her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was all part of a larger game, one that she didn't fully understand. And as the room continued to watch them, to wait for the next move, Emily couldn't help but wonder, was she part of this game, or was she simply a pawn in it? The Duke finally released the back of her chair, his fingers lingering for a moment longer than necessary, a subtle reminder of his control over her. Without a word, he stood, his posture straight, his gaze still fixed on her. The movement was small, but it felt monumental, as if the world around them had shifted once again. He was the center of attention, the one who held all the power. And Emily? She was standing at his side, caught in the web he had spun, unsure of her place in it. The silence in the room deepened, the tension mounting with each passing second. Emily could feel it, her breath coming faster, her hands trembling in her lap. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of it all. She had never been a part of this world, never been seen as more than an accessory, a background character in the lives of those who truly mattered. But now, she was at the center of it, and the weight of that realization nearly crushed her. The Duke's eyes flicked to her once again, and this time, there was no mistaking it. There was something there, something that made her feel exposed, vulnerable, yet alive with the knowledge that she was his choice. His fingers brushed the edge of her sleeve as he leaned closer, his voice low, just for her ears. "Do not mistake your position," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "You are here because I want you here. Nothing more, nothing less." His words sent a chill through her, but it was not fear she felt. It was a strange, exhilarating sense of power. She was his choice. She was at his side, and no one could take that away from her. But even as the words settled in her mind, she knew that the battle was far from over. The tension in the room had not been resolved. It had only grown. The power shift that had started with the Duke's choice was far from complete. There were still those who would challenge her, still those who would test the Duke's decision, still those who would attempt to break her. But she would not let them. Not now. Not when she had finally been seen. The Duke's eyes never left her as he stood straighter, his posture commanding the room. The whispers grew louder, the air thick with disapproval and curiosity, but Emily didn't flinch. She met their gazes head-on, no longer hiding in the shadows, no longer the invisible woman in the corner. She had been chosen, and she would not be overlooked again. The Duke's grip on her had tightened, but it wasn't just his hand on her arm now. It was the weight of his expectations, his world, pressing down on her. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. She was no longer a spectator. She was a player, and she wasn't about to lose. The room continued to hum with whispers, the tension building with every passing moment. Emily could feel the storm coming, but she was ready. The game had begun, and she was no longer just a pawn. She was a queen in her own right, and the Duke's world was now hers to navigate. The silence in the room had become unbearable, the tension now so thick it was almost palpable. Emily's chest rose and fell with each breath, her heart pounding in her ears. Duke William Montague sat beside her, his presence so commanding that the very air around them seemed to hum with power. The room was alive with the murmurs of the guests, the once celebratory atmosphere now tainted by their judgment and curiosity. Emily had always felt invisible, a quiet observer in a world that didn't care for her. But tonight, that had changed. The Duke had chosen her, and that choice had shifted everything. The whispers around her grew louder, sharper. The other women, once polite and passive, now threw daggers with their eyes. She could feel their disdain, their disapproval. But it wasn't just them. The Duke's power was tangible, and she could feel it pressing in on her, a constant reminder that she was in this world now, whether she wanted to be or not. Every move they made was under a microscope. Every word they spoke weighed and measured by those around them. The weight of their expectations was crushing, but the Duke remained an unshakable force beside her. His eyes never left her, and as the evening wore on, Emily began to feel the pressure building. It was as if the very air around them had become charged, the tension between them crackling like static. She couldn't escape it, couldn't ignore it. The Duke's hand had settled on the back of her chair, his fingers close enough that she could feel the warmth of his touch, but not quite enough to offer any comfort. The room had fallen silent again, all eyes turned toward them, waiting for the next move. And then, a voice pierced the silence. "This is a mockery," Lady Eleanor's voice rang out, cold and laced with venom. "A woman of her standing has no place here, Duke. She is an embarrassment." The words hit Emily like a slap, and she could feel her breath catch in her throat. The weight of Lady Eleanor's words, the cruelty of them, was undeniable. The other noblewomen around them murmured in agreement, their eyes narrowing, their judgment clear. But it was not just the women who watched, it was everyone. The guests, the men, All looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. She could feel it, the sharpness of their gazes, the disapproval that radiated from them. It was as though they were waiting for her to fail, for her to stumble. But the Duke's hand tightened on the back of her chair, a subtle shift, a silent command. The room grew colder, the whispers fading into nothing as his presence filled the space. "You will not speak to her that way," he said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "She is not to be dismissed." The words landed with the weight of a hammer, and, for a moment, the room was still. Lady Eleanor's face flushed with outrage, her lips pressed tight in a thin line, but she didn't speak again. She couldn't. The Duke had spoken, and in this world, his word was law. The shift in power was undeniable. Emily felt it as if a wave had passed through the room, sweeping away the tension, the whispers, the judgment. The Duke had defended her, but it wasn't just his words that had shifted the balance. It was his power, the sheer force of his presence, that had commanded the room to fall silent. And now, the eyes that had once judged her with disdain were now filled with something else: fear, awe, uncertainty. The women who had once seen her as nothing more than a background figure now saw her as a force to be reckoned with, a woman who had been chosen by the Duke himself. As the Duke's gaze shifted from Lady Eleanor to the rest of the room, Emily felt the weight of his stare, his unspoken command. She was no longer the invisible one, the one they could ignore. She was the one they had to reckon with. The tension between them hadn't dissipated, it had only grown. The Duke's gaze was sharp, calculating, and Emily couldn't help but feel the pull of it, like a magnet drawing her in. She had been chosen by him, but she didn't understand why. The power he wielded was clear, but the reasons behind his decision were still a mystery to her. And as the night wore on, she felt the weight of that mystery pressing down on her. She had always thought she wanted to be seen, to be noticed, to be acknowledged. But now that she wasn't sure she was ready for the consequences. The eyes of the room were still on her, their judgment hanging in the air, but she couldn't look away from the Duke. His eyes held her captive, his presence so overwhelming that she felt as though she were drowning in it. She had been chosen, but at what cost? What would happen now that she was no longer invisible? The questions swirled in her mind, but she didn't have the answers. All she knew was that the Duke's power was a force to be reckoned with, and now, it was hers to navigate. She had no choice but to follow, to walk this path that had been set before her, whether she wanted to or not. The tension in the room continued to rise, the power shifting with every passing second. And as the Duke's hand finally left her chair, Emily knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The game had begun, and she was no longer just a pawn. She was a player in this dangerous, unpredictable world, and there was no turning back. The air in the ballroom was thick with anticipation, the tension unbearable as the room held its breath. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the moment pressing down on her like a storm on the horizon. Duke William Montague's presence beside her was overwhelming, his silent command filling the space around them. She had been chosen. But now, with every second that passed, she felt the enormity of that choice. The eyes of the entire room trained on her, waiting, watching, judging. The whispers had died down, replaced by a suffocating silence that seemed to stretch forever. Emily could feel the cold weight of it, the room's judgment pressing down on her like a tangible force. The guests had fallen silent, their eyes on the Duke, on her, waiting for what would come next. The power dynamics in the room had shifted, but the question that lingered was what would happen next. The Duke had defended her, but there was still an undercurrent of tension, an unresolved conflict that seemed to hang in the air like an unspoken dare. She could feel it in the way the guests were watching, in the way they whispered behind their fans, their words sharp with disdain. She could feel the eyes of the other women on her, the envy, the contempt, the challenge. The women who had once smiled at her with false kindness now saw her as a threat, something to be disposed of, something that had no place in their world. And yet, she was the one at the Duke's side. She was the one who had been chosen. But the question still gnawed at her. Why? What did he want from her? The Duke's eyes flicked to her once more, sharp, unreadable. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, every word felt like a command, like a decree that no one could ignore. His presence in the room was a force, a constant reminder of who controlled the power, who had the right to make decisions. Emily could feel his power like a weight in the air, his hand resting lightly on the back of her chair, the warmth of his fingers almost electric against her skin. She wasn't sure if it was the Duke's influence or the pressure of the room that made her feel so small, so exposed, but she knew one thing. She couldn't escape it. The Duke had chosen her, but now the room was questioning that choice, and Emily could feel the ripples of doubt, the whispers of those who thought she wasn't worthy. And then, as if to push the tension to its breaking point, another voice cut through the silence. "This is absurd," a man's voice rang out, his tone filled with disbelief and contempt. The crowd parted, and Lord Ashford, one of the most influential men in the room, stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the Duke. "You're making a fool of yourself, Duke. She is nothing. A woman like her has no place beside you." The words hit Emily like a slap, and she could feel her breath catch in her throat. The room seemed to freeze in that moment. Every eye turned toward her, every whisper silenced. Lord Ashford's gaze was filled with disdain, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. And the worst part was, she could feel the truth of it. She had always been invisible, always been dismissed, and now here she was, at the center of it all, but still, deep down, she didn't know if she belonged. The Duke didn't move, didn't flinch. His eyes locked onto Lord Ashford, cold and unwavering. For a moment, the room was frozen in time, the power shifting, the tension palpable. The Duke's voice broke the silence, calm and authoritative, his words like a thunderclap in the stillness. "You will not speak of her that way," he said, his tone ice cold. "She is mine to choose, and no one will question my decision." The room held its breath. Lord Ashford's face flushed with anger, his lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't speak again. The Duke had spoken, and there was no room for argument. The power in the room had shifted once more, but this time, it wasn't just the Duke's presence that commanded the room. It was his words, his unshakable authority. Emily could feel the weight of his gaze on her, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw something shift in his eyes, something softer, something almost tender. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the cold mask of power that he wore so effortlessly. The tension in the room was now palpable, and Emily could feel it. The battle was far from over. The whispers had stopped, but the judgment hadn't. The guests, the women who had once thought her insignificant, now watched her with a new kind of scrutiny, their eyes narrowing, their lips tight with disapproval. She was no longer the invisible one. She was the center of attention, and the pressure was almost too much to bear. The Duke's hand remained on her chair, and though his touch was light, it was enough to send a jolt of energy through her. She was still his, still bound to him by the power he wielded. And in that moment, Emily realized the truth. She wasn't just a part of his world. She was a part of the game he played, and the rules of that game were just beginning to unfold. She had been chosen, but she wasn't sure what that meant yet. She wasn't sure if she was ready for the battles that lay ahead. But she had no choice now. The Duke had chosen her, and with that choice came a power she couldn't escape, a game she was now a part of, whether she wanted it or not. The tension between them, between her and the world she had been thrust into, was still unresolved. And as the guests around her whispered again, their voices low, Emily knew that the storm was far from over. It had only just begun. The room held its breath, the tension so thick it seemed to press on every corner of the vast ballroom. The Duke's hand remained on the back of Emily's chair, and though the contact was light, it felt like a brand on her skin, marking her as his. The eyes of the room were on them, a silent audience to the power play unfolding before them. Emily felt the weight of it, the heavy gaze of every noble, every lord and lady who had watched her rise from the shadows. She had been chosen, and yet, as she sat there, her heart racing in her chest, she could feel the storm brewing around her, the questions that lingered in the air like a scent of impending rain. Why had the Duke chosen her? What was it that made her different from all the others? As the evening wore on, the tension only grew, like a pressure that was building to an inevitable breaking point. The guests whispered among themselves, their voices low and filled with judgment, their eyes flicking to Emily with a mix of envy, disdain, and curiosity. The Duke's silence was unsettling, but it was also a shield, an impenetrable wall that kept the world at bay. He had claimed her, But what did that truly mean? And more importantly, what was the cost of being his choice? Her mind raced as the whispers swirled around her, but she couldn't escape the feeling that she was walking a tightrope, with no idea what lay beneath her feet. Then, as if to answer her silent questions, a voice sliced through the tension. A man, one of the Duke's closest allies, stepped forward. "Duke Montague," he said, his voice smooth but edged with an unmistakable challenge. "You've made your decision. But what of the consequences?" The words hit Emily like a slap, her breath catching in her throat as all eyes shifted to the man. His gaze was sharp, his words laced with an undertone of something darker, something that made Emily's pulse race. The Duke didn't move, didn't even flinch at the question. His eyes locked onto the man, and for a moment, the room seemed to still, as if time itself had paused. "What do you mean by consequences?" the Duke asked, his voice low, calm, but with a chill that sent a ripple through the room. The man's eyes flickered with something unspoken, something dangerous. "You've chosen a woman with no connections, no standing, no power. She is a liability, Duke. And we all know how dangerous liabilities can be." The words echoed in the room, louder than any whisper, louder than any thought Emily had ever had about her place here. She could feel the heat of their judgment, the weight of their disapproval, and in that moment, the power dynamic in the room shifted once again. The Duke's hand tightened on the back of her chair, a subtle but unmistakable signal that this conversation was over. But even as the tension in the room rose to a new level, Emily felt something shift within her. She had been chosen, yes, but now, she was a part of this world. The world of power, of politics, of dangerous games. And the Duke? He was her anchor in this storm, but he was also the one who had dragged her into it. The room fell silent, waiting for the Duke's response, and Emily could feel every eye on her, every breath held in anticipation. The man who had spoken looked to the Duke, his eyes narrowed, but the Duke didn't look away. His gaze was steady, unwavering, like a storm that had already passed. "I made my choice," the Duke said, his voice cold and final. "And I will not be swayed by the opinions of men like you." The room seemed to exhale collectively, the tension breaking for a brief moment before rising again. The man who had challenged the Duke stood silent, his lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't argue. The Duke had spoken, and in his world, his word was law. The power dynamic had shifted again, and this time, it was absolute. Emily's heart raced in her chest as the weight of what had just transpired settled over her. She had been publicly defended by the Duke, his words cutting through the air with a finality that left no room for doubt. She was no longer just a pawn in this game. She was a player. The Duke's eyes flicked to her, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of something almost imperceptible, something that made her heart skip a beat. His lips parted, and he leaned slightly toward her, his breath warm against her ear. "You are more than just a choice," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the room. "You are my declaration." The words sent a shockwave through Emily's chest, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected him to say anything like this. She had always thought she was simply an object, a pawn in the Duke's game. But now, as his words sank into her skin, she realized that she was something more. She was part of his world, part of his story. The room seemed to fade away, the voices becoming distant echoes in her mind. The power between them was palpable, and for the first time, Emily understood what it truly meant to be the Duke's choice. She was no longer just the forgotten woman in the corner. She was his. And in that moment, everything changed. The guests resumed their conversations, but Emily could still feel the weight of the moment, the shift in power that had happened right before her eyes. The Duke had chosen her, and in doing so, he had reshaped her world. But as the evening wore on, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The games, the power struggles, the battles, everything was still ahead of her. She had been chosen, but now, she had to find her place in this new world. And that, Emily realized, would be the hardest part of all. The air in the ballroom seemed to crackle with electricity as the truth finally began to unfold, a truth that would change everything. Emily sat rigidly in her chair, her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of the Duke's words still lingering in her ears. Her mind raced, spinning in 1,000 different directions, trying to make sense of the chaos that had erupted around her. The guests whispered, their voices rising in volume, the tension in the room growing thicker with every passing moment. The once comfortable silence had shattered, replaced by the harsh reality of what had just been revealed. Lady Eleanor had stepped forward again, her face flushed with anger, her eyes flashing with fury. "You think she's worthy of standing by your side, Duke?" Lady Eleanor's voice rang out, sharp and filled with disbelief. "She's nothing but a common girl, a nobody. You're making a fool of yourself." The words sliced through the room like a knife, and Emily felt the sting of them deep in her chest. The Duke's hand, which had been resting lightly on her chair, tightened, his fingers curling into the backrest with a force that sent a shiver down her spine. His gaze never left Lady Eleanor, his eyes cold and calculating. The power in the room shifted once more, and Emily felt it. In every fiber of her being. The tension was now unbearable, the pressure of the moment suffocating her. "She is everything." The Duke finally spoke, his voice low and filled with an authority that silenced the entire room. "She is the one I have chosen, and that is not for you to question." His words carried the weight of finality, and in that moment, the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Emily could feel the Duke's presence beside her, the strength of his command radiating through the space. She had been chosen. She had been thrust into this world of power and politics, where every decision, every action, had consequences. But the real twist, the true revelation, was just beginning to unravel. Lady Eleanor stood there, her expression twisted with anger and disbelief. She opened her mouth to speak again, but the Duke raised his hand, silencing her with a single, imperious gesture. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You will not question my decisions again." The room fell silent. Emily could hear the soft, rapid beat of her own heart as she sat frozen in place. The power shift had reached its peak, and now there was no going back. The truth had been revealed, and the consequences were rippling through the room like a shockwave. But the Duke wasn't done. His gaze shifted to Emily, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that sent a chill through her. "You've been silent long enough," he said, his voice softer now, almost gentle, though it still held that same commanding edge. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she realized he was addressing her. She hadn't spoken a word since the chaos had begun, her mind racing too quickly to form any coherent thoughts. But now, as the Duke's eyes fixed on her, she felt the weight of the moment crashing down on her. She opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. She was trapped in the swirl of emotions, of uncertainty and fear, of power and helplessness. The Duke reached over, his hand brushing gently against hers, a subtle but intimate gesture that made her skin tingle. The touch was like fire, burning through her hesitation, leaving a mark on her soul. The room was still, all eyes on them, waiting for her to speak, to make her own declaration. She could feel their judgment, the weight of their expectations pressing down on her like a mountain. She had been chosen by the Duke, but now, she had to stand on her own. She had to find her place in this world, in this game of power and control. The Duke's hand stayed on hers, a steady presence, but it was not enough to quiet the storm inside her. The emotions that had been building since the moment she had stepped into this room came rushing to the surface. The pressure, the fear, the anticipation, they were all too much. She stood, her legs trembling beneath her, but she forced herself to stand tall. She would not let them see her falter. "I will not be silent anymore," Emily finally said, her voice shaky at first, but growing stronger with each word. "I am here because I have been chosen, and I will not let anyone, not even you, take that away from me." The words were a declaration, a promise to herself, a promise to the Duke, and to everyone else in the room. The power in her words was not lost on the guests, and for the first time, Emily saw something in their eyes. It was no longer just judgment or disdain. Now, there was something else, respect, perhaps fear, even awe. The room had shifted once more, and Emily had found her place within it. She wasn't the forgotten girl in the corner anymore. She wasn't the invisible one. She was here, standing beside the Duke, chosen and unshakable. The tension in the air seemed to dissipate, replaced by a new kind of energy, a new kind of power. The Duke's eyes softened, just for a moment, and for the briefest of seconds, Emily felt the full weight of his gaze. But then, just as quickly, The mask of control returned, the unshakable power that he wore like a second skin. He stood, and without a word, he led her through the ballroom, his hand still on hers, guiding her toward whatever came next. The guests parted, as they always did, for the Duke. But now, they also parted for her, for the woman who had been chosen, for the woman who had claimed her place. The game was far from over, but Emily knew this. She had made it. She had taken her place in this world, and no one would take that from her. The power had shifted again, and this time, it was in her hands as much as it was in the Duke's. The tension that had once suffocated her now felt like a force she could control. She was no longer just a pawn. She was a player, and the game had only just begun. The ballroom was alive with a muted hum of conversation, but Emily felt as though the entire world had slowed to a crawl around her. She sat beside Duke William, his presence unwavering, commanding, but there was something different in the air now, something that had changed the very fabric of this night. His hand rested on the back of her chair once again, but this time it felt like more than just a gesture of power. It felt like a bond, a connection that neither of them had fully acknowledged until now. The weight of what had transpired, the revelations, the challenges, all of it hung in the air like smoke. The tension had reached its peak, but the room was still holding its breath, as if waiting for the final twist. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her composure. She had been chosen by the Duke. She had been thrust into this world of power and control, but she had not yet fully understood what that meant. The past moments had shattered her assumptions, twisted her understanding, but now, there was clarity. She was no longer the invisible woman in the corner. She was no longer the forgotten one. She was the one who had stood beside the Duke when everything around her threatened to crumble. But what came next? The question lingered in her mind, but she didn't have the answer. She wasn't sure she was ready for the consequences of this power shift, for what it meant to be at the center of his world. She glanced at him, the Duke's sharp eyes watching her, unreadable as always. He had made his choice. But what did he want from her? The answer was still buried somewhere deep within him, somewhere she hadn't yet unlocked. The Duke's hand moved, just slightly, brushing against the edge of her wrist. A subtle gesture, but it sent a shiver through her. A reminder of the invisible power that connected them, whether she understood it or not. The room around them was still, as if the entire world had paused for a moment, holding its breath, waiting. Lady Eleanor, the one who had challenged the Duke so fiercely, now stood in the distance, her eyes narrowed, her expression one of pure disdain. Emily could feel the heat of her gaze, but it was different now. Before, it had been a stare of judgment, of contempt, but now, it was something else. Fear, perhaps. Fear of what the Duke's decision meant for her and the rest of the room. The Duke had made it clear, Emily was his choice. But as she sat there, at his side, the weight of that choice still hung over her, still threatened to crush her. What did it mean to be chosen by him? What role would she play in this intricate web of power and politics? Before she could process her thoughts, the Duke spoke, his voice low, but filled with authority. "We are not done yet," he said, his eyes not leaving hers. Emily felt the intensity of his gaze, like a sharp blade pressing into her skin, and for the first time since they had entered the ballroom together, she felt like they were alone, like the rest of the world didn't exist. His words were not just a statement. They were a command, an invitation to something bigger. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, but she didn't look away. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but her words carried the weight of everything she had been holding back. The Duke leaned slightly closer, his breath warm against her ear. "It means that what we've begun here is just the start," he murmured, his voice laced with something dangerous, something she couldn't quite place. "The world will watch us now. They will see who we are, and we will decide how it ends." Emily's heart raced in her chest, the full force of his words settling over her like a heavy cloak. She had been chosen, but this was more than just a choice. This was a declaration. They were not just a part of the world now. They were going to shape it. The room seemed to hold its breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on Emily's shoulders. The Duke had made his move, and now, it was her turn to play her part. She had no choice but to accept it, but as the world around her swirled, as the pressure mounted, she couldn't help but feel a sense of power rising within her. She was no longer just a piece on the board. She had a role to play, and it was hers to define. The Duke's hand shifted again, this time more firmly on her back, guiding her to stand. She followed his lead, her legs trembling beneath her, but there was no turning back now. As they moved through the ballroom, every eye was on them, every whisper still hanging in the air. The power had shifted, but now, it was clear, the game was just beginning. The Duke led her toward the center of the room, where the crowd had gathered, their faces a mixture of awe, envy, and disbelief. But for the first time, Emily didn't shrink back. She stood tall beside him, her presence felt, her power undeniable. The room parted for them, and Emily felt the weight of their stares, but she no longer felt small. She no longer felt like the invisible girl she had once been. The Duke had chosen her, and now, she was a force in her own right. The tension in the room didn't dissipate. It still hung there, thick and suffocating, but it was different now. Emily had stepped into her power, and the world around her would have to reckon with it. The Duke's hand on her back was steady, a constant reminder that she was not alone in this game. But she was no longer just a pawn. She was a player. And as the ballroom faded into the background, Emily realized that this was only the beginning. The real game was yet to come. The ballroom had grown quiet, the weight of the moment settling over the room like an unspoken promise. Emily stood at the center, her heart racing, her breath shallow, as Duke William Montague remained by her side. The tension that had filled the air for so long now felt like a living, breathing entity, surrounding them both. The guests, still and silent, watched with a mixture of awe, fear, and curiosity. They had witnessed the power shift, the rising storm that had brought Emily to the center of it all, but now, they were waiting for the final piece of the puzzle. The Duke's eyes were fixed on her, unwavering, as if he had already seen everything she was capable of, but he was waiting for her to take the next step. Emily could feel the weight of his gaze, the power in it, and it was both a burden and a gift. She had been chosen, yes, but in this moment, it wasn't about the Duke's decision anymore. It was about her, about what she was going to do next. The game had shifted, the stakes had been raised, and now, she had to prove herself, not just to the Duke, but to everyone who had doubted her, who had looked past her. She was no longer the forgotten noblewoman. She wasn't just a pawn in the Duke's world. She was a player, and she was about to make her move. Her body was tense, her mind racing, but as she stood there, she felt a sudden clarity wash over her. She had nothing left to prove. Not to Lady Eleanor, not to the guests, not even to the Duke. She had made it. She had stood tall through the judgment, through the whispers, through the disdain. She had earned her place here. She took a deep breath, her chest expanding as she straightened her posture, feeling the weight of the room's eyes on her, but no longer intimidated by them. She felt powerful. She felt like she belonged. The Duke's hand, which had remained so steady on the back of her chair, moved, not to guide her, but to rest lightly on her arm. The touch was not possessive, not commanding. It was a recognition, a silent acknowledgement of what had changed. The power between them had been balanced. They were not two separate forces anymore. They were united, standing as equals in this game of politics and power. The room was still, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to fade away. It was just Emily and the Duke, standing together, facing down the consequences of their choices, their futures uncertain but entwined. A subtle shift in the air, and Emily looked up at him, her gaze steady. She didn't need to speak. The unspoken understanding between them was enough. But the Duke's lips parted, breaking the silence that had settled over them. His voice, low and calm, filled the space. "You've earned your place," he said, his words a quiet affirmation, but they carried the weight of something much greater. Emily's chest tightened, but this time, it was with pride, not fear. She had earned her place, not by standing at his side, but by standing on her own. The tension that had filled the room before had now shifted into something else. Respect, perhaps, or fear. But either way, it was hers now. The Duke's gaze never left hers, his expression unreadable as always, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of approval, that made her feel seen. "This is just the beginning," he murmured, his hand still resting on her arm. "But I know you will rise to meet it." The words were a challenge, a declaration, but Emily knew they were also a promise. He had chosen her, but now, they were bound by the game they had begun. The room seemed to hold its breath once again, the guests still watching, their whispers turning into murmurs of awe and curiosity. Emily could feel their eyes on her, but for the first time, she didn't care. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need their validation. She had the Duke's respect, and more importantly, she had her own. The moment lingered, frozen in time, as if the world was waiting for her to make her move. And when she did, the energy in the room shifted once more, the power completely in her hands. She took a step forward, her posture unyielding, her eyes never leaving the Duke's. For a brief moment, everything stood still. The power, the expectations, the consequences, it all seemed to hang in the air, suspended. Then, with a quiet nod, she turned her attention to the room, her gaze sweeping over the guests who had once dismissed her, who had once believed she would fade into the background. They would see now. They would understand that she was no longer a part of their game. She was playing on her own terms. The room